writer of Hebrews introduced Melchizedek in chapter 5, if you remember. But then he dealt with some issues, and so now he comes back in chapter 7 and deals with Melchizedek. Now, well, we'll just start with the first slide. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So, the sum total of what is said about Melchizedek in the Old Testament takes place in Genesis, the 14th chapter. And we'll read that. Basically, the writer just summarized what was said. After Abraham returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abraham, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And then, of course, we have what's said in Psalms 110. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And so the writer here will deal with both of these passages and talking about Melchizedek. Now, the ancient rabbis, there was a lot of speculation about who Melchizedek was, who he was, what was said about him, a lot of pilpul that was written about him. But the writer here of Hebrews explains everything to us about Melchizedek and his meaning and such. The fact that he appears in the pages of the Genesis and disappears in the pages of Genesis, and yet was so great that Abram gave him a tenth and was blessed by him, and we know virtually nothing about him. Well, there's a reason for that. And so that's what we'll talk about this evening. Now, his name, it says Melchizedek was king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. His name literally means king of righteousness. And so that will play a part in what he's got to say here. Now, you remember that as he goes through here, as he goes through the book of Hebrews, and the inferiority of what they were he was scared that they were falling back into under the old law, the inferiority of what they were going back to as opposed to the superiority of Christ and the gospel and the church. He continues to show that. And this is really a master class in what how to deal with people that are in Jews, dealing with what the Old Testament has to say and showing that it is inferior to what we have today. So his name means king of righteousness. He was king of Salem. And of course, the word Salem means peace. So he was king of peace. He was king of righteousness. Abraham recognized and honored him as a divine priest, and that's significant. Okay? He recognized him for who he was. Now, Jesus is what? He's king of righteousness. What is Jesus? He's king of peace. So we have the type, Melchizedek, and the antitype, Jesus. And so that is what the writer is going to continue to show. Now, there's speculation of he was king of Salem, meaning that there was a city known at that time as Salem. and such. It was at Jerusalem. I don't know. Some say it was. Some say it was Shechem. Some say it was other things. We really don't know, and that's speculation. And the writer doesn't tell us exactly where that was, and it's really meaningless for what we're learning here. So, the writer is going to show the inferiority of the Levitical priesthood to that of Melchizedek, and so that's is highlighted here. Now you'll see that he points out that he was appointed priest and therefore was not limited to the single nation of Israel. Okay? In fact, Israel didn't exist. He was a high priest. Abram recognized him as a high priest, and so he wasn't limited to that. As we've noted, he was king as well. Not only a priest, but king. His priesthood was not dependent on a descendancy from Levitical parents, but as king of righteousness. So, the idea, of course, they could not be king. The Levites could not be a king. So, when you talk about Melchizedek, he was both king and priest. He was not dependent on any kind of genealogy, any kind of descendancy from parents that were Levites and such. And he attained that because he was righteous. And that, of course, will come to play with Jesus. Without a birth or death recorded, there is no beginning to his priesthood and no end. We don't know when his priesthood began. And so we don't know when he died. We don't know when the end came. And it really didn't, as we'll see in a few moments. He received tithes from Abraham himself, not because he had no land inheritance, okay, and that's important, and was dependent on his brethren, but because of his greatness. You see, and we'll get into this in a few moments, but the Levites, they received tithes from their brethren because they had no land inheritance. They were dependent upon them. And so when the other tribes gave, their tithes, it went to the Levites. And of course, he blessed Abraham, who was, of course, the father of the Levites. So we've got 6 points about Melchizedek that the writer is going to be talking about here. And of course, those 6 points will ultimately apply to Jesus because of Psalms 110 and verse 4, which we've already read. Now, it was extremely important because now when we talk about the, without beginning of days, without end of life, without a genealogy and such, that was of huge importance. If you couldn't trace your genealogy as a Levitical priest, you were disqualified from being a priest. Nehemiah, the 7th chapter and 64th verse, says these searched for their family records, but they could not find them, so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. You had to be able to trace your priesthood all the way back. And that's the reason genealogies were so important. But Melchizedek didn't have a genealogy. There's nothing said about his parents. There's nothing said about any descendants. We don't know if he had any descendants. So his priesthood was not dependent upon a genealogy. His priesthood didn't necessarily start at any time because we wasn't given that. It didn't necessarily end at any time. We don't know all about the Levitical priesthood and everything, but we do know that some Levites, depending on what their service was, they were limited by age. In Numbers, the 4th chapter and 1st through 4, and we'll go to Numbers 4:15 in a minute. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take a census of the Kohathite branch of the Levites by their clans and families. Count all the men from 30 to 50 years of age who come to serve in the work in the tent of meeting. This is the work of the Kohathites in the tent of meeting, the care of the most holy things. So why were these particular Levites, their particular job, the Kohathites, their particular job, they could only serve from the age of 30 to the age 50? Well, Verse 15 tells us, after Aaron and his sons had finished covering the holy furnishings and all the holy articles, and when the camp is ready to move, the Kohathites are to come to do the carrying. But they must not touch the holy things or they will die. The Kohathites are to carry those things that are in the tent of meeting. So there were Levites that in the Levitical priesthood whose job was to carry these holy things, and they had to be between 30 and 50. After 50, we all lose a little muscle mass, okay? And some of us lose more muscle mass than others, but we all lose that. So the fact that there was no genealogy, there was no start time to his priesthood, there's no end time to his priesthood. Like the Son of Man, he remains a priest forever, without an end to his days or priesthood. We don't know anything about that. He will always be referred to as priest of the Most High God. Now, there are people that will look at this and go, well, it says he was a priest forever and such. And he is, but he's in the sense that, did he die? Yes, he died, okay? Did his priesthood continue on into the heavenly realms? Probably not. I don't think that's what it's saying. But without an end to his priesthood, without nothing that tells us when his priesthood ends, he will always be referred to as the high priest of the Most High. So when you talk about Melchizedek, he's the high priest of the Most High. But more than that, Jesus was of the same order. And we'll get into that in just a minute. That perpetuates the priesthood. He is of the same order, according to Psalms 110, verse 4, as the priesthood of Melchizedek. And so, as the Levites were of the same order, okay, theirs passed from person to person, so the priesthood of Melchizedek was continued on with the high priesthood of Jesus. So he remains a priest forever. All right. Moving on, fourth verse. Think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, as we pointed out, Numbers 18:24, instead, I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. That is why I said concerning them, they will have no inheritance among the Israelites. They didn't have a land inheritance. So they were dependent, in order to do their priestly duties, upon the tithes from their brethren. Now, when he says there that just think how great he was, even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now, the Levites got a tenth because the law said that they had to. They were required to give the Levites a tenth. Abram wasn't required to give Melchizedek a tenth, but he did. So, in that particular sense, who is the greater there? The Levitical priesthood or Melchizedek's priesthood? Obviously, it's Melchizedek. And then he goes on to say that it wasn't enough, if that wasn't enough, okay, to show the greatness of Melchizedek, he goes on to say that he blessed him, talking about Melchizedek blessing Abraham, who had the promises. Now, that again is significant, and you can see as the writer is beginning to build here with the readers that they would have to be questioning, and that's his whole purpose, I believe, their move back under the Mosaic law. Okay? He's showing that the Levitical priesthood simply wasn't good enough. And that the introduction of Melchizedek, and certainly Psalms 110 and verse 4, talking about Jesus being a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, that he is showing his superiority to the Levites. Obviously, Melchizedek was superior to the Levites. He took a tenth from Abraham, and then he goes on to bless Abraham. And Abraham was the one who had the promise. Now, we go on and look at verse 7, and it says, and without a doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. In the one case, the tenth collected by men who die, but in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Now, verse 7 is axiomatic, okay? He says, without doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. There's no argument about that, okay? The greater person blesses the lesser person. That's just the way it is. That's what happens, okay? So who was greater here? Okay? You Hebrews are wanting to go back under the Levitical priesthood. Who is greater? It's Melchizedek. He was greater than the Levitical priesthood. In fact, he goes on to say that the tenth, he said, is collected by men who die. The Levitical priesthood was a series of descendancies that they had to trace their genealogy. This person lived, he had children, he died. This one lived and died, and this one lived and died, and this one lived and died. We know nothing about Melchizedek's death because it wasn't given to us. Therefore, as he's already pointed out, he's a priest forever. Now, he says, one might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. So the Levitical priesthood collected tithes that would be passed on to their successors in a continuous line as each died and their priesthood ended. Not so with Melchizedek. Even Levi, the very receiver of tithes under the laws, paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now, you want to look at that and go, well, now, seriously, isn't that kind of a stretch to say that Levi actually paid tithes? No, not at all. You know, we make decisions, corporations make decisions, businesses make decisions, individuals make decisions all the time that will affect our prodigy. You know, I can make a decision today that is going to affect whatever inheritance my children end up getting when the two of us die. I can have a will that says it's going to go this way and this way and this way, 4 ways or whatever, and everything. And I have it in the will. But I can choose. I can make a decision and choose to spend it all today. And they get nothing, no matter what the will is. I can make those decisions. Abraham made a decision and everything that would affect his posterity, the Levites. And so in that sense, they paid a tenth to Melchizedek themselves. The receiver of the tithes from their own brethren would have paid that tenth. So, he says, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and this is a big one, for on the basis of it the law was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? Now, having shown that the Levitical priesthood was below that of Melchizedek, the writer moves on to what in what respects it's lacking. It appears that the assumption of the readers was that the Levitical priesthood was the means of completing or perfecting the people that the priesthood served. But if so, why was there a need for another? And that is the stunning question that his readers simply don't have an answer for. If the Levitical priesthood could actually do and complete or perfect the people that it served, why would God say there's another priesthood coming? One in the order of Melchizedek, not in the Levitical priesthood. Because it couldn't. It couldn't perfect its people. Now, one in the order of Melchizedek, and the order, there's the order, we can talk about the order of the Levitical priesthood, okay? The order of the priesthood of Melchizedek, okay? And that word order is simply a type or arranging, and it actually can mean a succession, okay? And such. So, we could talk about the priestly order and everything. Well, the priestly order of the Levites was one thing. That priestly order said that you had to be descended from Levi. You had to be able to trace your descendancy from Levi. And in some cases, your priesthood couldn't even start at a certain time and had to end at a certain time. You had to marry a descendant of Levi. There was all these things that were part of that. And you served your brethren, and you received tithes from your brethren. Well, the order of Melchizedek was that it was a priesthood forever, that it was greater than Abraham, that it received tithes from Abraham himself. And in Psalms 110 and verse 4, as we've already read, he says, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." So the priestly order of the Levites was this. The priestly order of Melchizedek extended through Jesus. And Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. Without a doubt, the greater blesses the lesser. The Levitical priesthood, though, could not attain what it was for. Now, the parenthetical in this, where it says, for on the basis of this, it was given to the people. Now, I don't want to get too far off on this. But depending on what translation it is translated under it, in other words, it would say, like in the KJV, it'll say, under it, the law was given to the people. And the ESV translates it that way. The ASV translates it that way. The NIV, as we see here, translates it this way. Numerous others translate it this way, and even some other ways. Linsky and McKnight reject both of those, both under it and on the basis of it, okay? And they note, and rightly so, that the law was not given to the people by the priesthood. The law was given to the people through Moses. Okay? So it really can't say under it and such. The word itself simply means on or upon. And honestly, I read quite a bit on this, probably more than I should have, because I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it. The Greek construction is way beyond me, okay? But personally, I lean on the context of what is being said here. And the context is on the idea that the priesthood was based on the law given to the people, and therefore divinely ordained. And this certainly fits the context of what we're fixing to see. The priesthood was based on or dependent upon the law that was given to the people. And he's going to tell us that as a result of that, if If you change the priesthood, you have to change the law. So, however, you want to look at that, that's the way I see it anyway. So, let's move on. So, verse 12. For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law. He whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. And what we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So again, we have another one of these axiomatic statements in verse 12. When there's a change of priesthood, there must be a change of the law. That's just the way it is. We understand this. Okay? If we remove, for whatever reason, you had the power and you're going to say, we want to remove the legislative branch of our government, then the Constitution is removed as well. Because what we have is, quote, unconstitutional. In order for that to happen, you would have to have a new constitution written. There has to be a change of the law. Okay? And so if the Levitical priesthood, of which Melchizedek is talking about, if there's a change in that priesthood, okay, and Jesus, it's of a different order, not of the Levitical order, then there has to be a change in the law. Now, the words okay. The change there, when it says there must be also a change of the law, this is rather interesting because the word there is metathesis. And that word can mean not just change, but removal. And in fact, in Hebrews, the 12th chapter and 27th verse, it says the words once more indicate removing of what can be shaken. That removing is the word metathesis. Okay? So, he's not just saying there must be a change of the law, but a removing of the law. And that, like I say, when we use the idea of our Constitution and removing the legislative branch or whatever and everything, it would make it therefore unconstitutional. You'd have to have a new constitution in order to have that take place. It would be a removal of that. And so, verse 16, where he says, obviously, Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, okay? And he makes this clear. I don't need to reiterate what the writer said here. Obviously, Judah was not part of the Levitical priesthood, could never be a part of the Levitical priesthood. And yet, Jesus, who was in the order of Melchizedek, okay, he said, what we've said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest, remember, what was Melchizedek's name? Melchizedek, King of Righteousness. One who has become a priest not on the basis of regulation to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Now, that word indestructible, akatalitos, cannot be brought to an end. It means that it cannot be brought to an end. It can mean indestructible. It can be endless. This is the only place in the New Testament this word is used. Some translations use the term endless. Some use indestructible. Some without an end. It's all pretty much the same thing and such. But he says on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry. That's what the NIV says. And I don't really care for that. I left it in here where he says there in verse 16, one who became a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry. And really, that's more of an interpretation than it is a translation. The word itself, or the words, is fleshly or carnal commandment or carnal regulation or fleshly regulation. And most commentators you'll find that says it's referring to ancestry or genealogy, which is basically what this is saying. But I think it's more encompassing than that. The writer is showing that the priesthood, on its physical level, okay, with an outward law that demanded a certain physical ancestry, an absence of physical defects, marriage to a reputable daughter of Aaron. That's what it required. What about being a really good person? What about being righteous? What about being caring? Didn't say anything about that. It was physical laws concerning them. And it produced people like we see in the New Testament of Caiaphas, Annas, terrible people. And you can go back in time and find high priests that were terrible people, but they fulfilled the carnal or fleshly regulation to be there. Not so with Melchizedek. He was king of righteousness. And not so with Jesus. But he received his righteousness based on the power of an endless or indestructible life. For it is declared you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. All right. He goes on to point out that the former regulation, talking about the Levitical priesthood, is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect. And a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. Now, this word set aside is athetesis, which means an annulment or removal. Okay? It's not just the former regulation was set aside, it was removed. The law was annulled. Okay? And it was annulled or removed because it was weak and useless. The law made nothing perfect. You know, the law, he talked about earlier, we talked about the completion or perfection of the people. The law could bring about no completion or perfection of the people it served. The Levitical priesthood could not bring about any kind of perfection. Now, I thought R.C.H. Linsky wrote something, and I put it up here because I thought he said it best, better than I could say it, where he says, in and of itself, the blood shed during the Old Testament could not remove sin. But in its connection with Christ's blood, it did remove sin. Its weakness and unprofitableness, its lack of completion, lay in the fact that in and of itself it could do nothing. That its entire efficacy depended on Christ's blood, which has yet to be shed. When that blood was finally shed, the whole Levitical priesthood and all its sacrifices, having served their purposes, were automatically disannulled. The better hope had come. So, let's move on. Verse 20. And he points out here, and it was not without an oath. Again, he's moving through these arguments, showing the greatness of Melchizedek, and thereby Jesus being our high priest after the order of Melchizedek had to be greater than the Levitical priesthood, which they were wanting to go back to. It was not without an oath. Others became priests without any oath. But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. The law could be changed, it could be removed, and it was. It was temporary. The Levites became priests because of the law, which was ultimately removed. Jesus became a priest by the oath of God, that which cannot be changed or removed. The old law could be removed, and it was. It was weak. It was useless. The Levitical priesthood couldn't do what they thought it could. But God said on an oath, so that it could not be changed, you are a priest, talking about Jesus, forever after the order of Melchizedek. And he goes on to point out that because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. We're under a better covenant. But how is Jesus the guarantee of that? Well, verse 25 will answer that for us. So we just move on. Now, there have been many priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Again, obvious. Therefore, he is able to save completely. How is he a guarantee of a better covenant? He is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. With each Levite, their priesthood ended and another took over, but not so with Christ. You know, back in verse 11 where it talked about completion and perfection were unattainable under the Levitical priesthood, that's not true. He is able to save completely. The Levitical priesthood could not complete anything. Jesus is the guarantee of a better covenant because it is complete. A guarantee because he always intercedes. All right, verse 26 through 28. And then we'll finish up. Such a high priest meets our needs. The Levitical priesthood didn't. Such a high priest meets our needs, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of his people. You know, that's what the Levites had to do. They had to go in and offer sacrifice for their own sins to begin with, before they could ever offer sacrifices for anybody else. Jesus was pure, blameless, holy, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He had no sin. That's the high priest that we want. That's the high priest that fits our needs. That's the high priest that will exist forever, interceding for us, guaranteeing the better covenant that we're under, not the old law, which has passed away because it was weak and useless. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak. And like I said, you can go through and look at the various high priests and various priests that served. And many of them were wicked men. And that's not the case. But the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect. Jesus is the perfect high priest. Now, I talked about this. I want to make a point here. Leviticus 16:16. It talks about, he's already talked about this, but it says Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Then it goes on in verse 9 to say, Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. So, again, every high priest had to offer himself a sacrifice for himself because he was full of sin. And that's certainly not the case with Jesus. He's pointing out that the weakness, the imperfectness, the lack of completeness that the Levitical priesthood had is not something that you want to go back under. Why would you want to go back under that when you've got the perfect high priest in Jesus who fulfills what is said in Psalms 110 and verse 4? Now, I want to make one other point here, because he says something here that is very important, and I don't think that we should overlook this. He says that the law appoints as high priest men who are weak, but the oath which came after the law. We can't miss that. You know, you can read by stuff and everything, but this is a huge point. Which came after the law, appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. The law established the Levitical priestly order. We know that. But the oath that established the priesthood of Christ came later. There's no arguing or saying, well, you know, that really applied back then or there. No, this came, Psalms 110 verse 4, it came after the law was given. Therefore, it supersedes the law. You can't argue that it's underneath the old law or somehow fits underneath that. No, he says it came after the law. So it supersedes that. And so when we get to the end here, it's just a master class of arguments that shows that what he's presenting here is simply unassailable. I mean, I don't know how anybody could look at that and go, well, yeah, but I still want to be under the Levitical priesthood. Well, you know, you couldn't come to that conclusion. He has laid out such a tremendous argument, and I do believe that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews and such. But the knowledge here and the laying out about Melchizedek, which so many people prior to this writing, you know, had all kinds of weird things. He lays out exactly what that was all about. Anyway, that's my lesson for tonight, so we'll open it up for comments, questions.
Appreciate it very much. You know, it's a very interesting chapter. You know, Melchizedek has no background as to where he came from. But when you think about it, of course, Abraham, you could follow his descendants. And, of course, the Levitical priesthood came from that. But Melchizedek was a king of righteousness, and his priesthood served everybody. It didn't just serve the Jews, it served everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And Abraham realized that and realized he was a superior one. He's blessing everybody. That's the way Christ does his priesthood. So when Christ's priesthood came into existence, it was like that of Melchizedek. Mm-hmm. So I thought the way you presented it was very good.
Oh, thank you.
I thought you did wonderful. That's a lot of material to cover in one setting, and I liked your 6 points you started out with. Kind of gave us a framework and went through it really, really good. Just kind of anecdotal. One of the things as a young Christian that helped me remember this about Melchizedek and the importance of this, because it is important to our Christianity, was probably about 1975 to 77. I was a young teenager, and Randy Ballard, a few years older than me, gave a lesson, and he titled it, "You Don't Have to Have Levi's Jeans to Be a Christian." Now, at that time, you've got to understand, in the mid to late 70s, everybody wanted Levi's jeans. That was the article of clothing to wear. It just, no matter what you had, as long as you had Levi's jeans to go with it, you know. And so he titled his lesson that, and when he got up, everybody was thinking, oh, he's going to talk about, you know, modesty. He's going to talk about trying to be popular and trying to be hip in the culture. And he got up and talked about this, and it was really interesting. It made an impression on me, and as a young Christian. And so anyway, I enjoyed your study tonight. But we don't have to have Levi's jeans, thank goodness.
We don't.
They are Christian.
Yeah. Appreciate it. Anybody over here? All right. Appreciate your attention and hope you got something out of this. We never want to close the service without extending the invitation that Christ offered so many years ago, and that is that we come believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized, we can become a Christian and be part of the church. If you need the prayers of the church for any reason, you can come forward while we stand and sing.